It wasn't a castle. It wasn't an abandoned house. It wasn't a centuries-old monastery. It was a law office with fluorescent lights, telephones, file cabinets, invoices. In 1967, in the Bavarian town of Rosenheim, something inside that office began to malfunction. Lights exploded. Phones dialed numbers that no one had called. A heavy filing cabinet moved across the floor. And the more technicians tried to fix it, the stranger it all became. Tonight, on the Midnight Drive, we're talking about the Rosenheim Poltergeist. The disturbances began quietly. Employees at the law office of Sigmund Adam noticed flickering lights. Telephones rang without anyone on the other end. Occasional electrical surges. At first, this all seemed mundane. Old wiring, faulty switches, normal office problems. But then the problems intensified. Light bulbs exploded with loud bangs. Ceiling lamps swung violently. Not gently. Not from air currents, but as if something had pushed them. The photocopier spilled its developing fluid repeatedly. Desk drawers opened. Sharp knocking sounds echoed through the rooms. And then came the telephones. Post office technicians installed monitoring equipment after the firm was billed for an unusual number of outgoing calls. Within 5 weeks, roughly 600 calls had been logged to the speaking clock. Sometimes 6 calls per minute. In one 15-minute span, 46 calls were recorded. This was 1967. Mechanical rotary dialing. The phones had been disabled. Only the lawyer himself held the key required to enable them. Yet the calls continued. Technicians replaced the wiring, they checked switches, they tested the circuits. The power company even recorded significant electrical fluctuations during periods that the phones were active. Readings that exceeded what the office system should have produced. At one point, all the light bulbs reportedly went out at once, with a loud explosion. A heavy filing cabinet was said to have shifted all the way across the floor. Pictures on the walls rotated by themselves. One was even reportedly filmed turning by itself on its hook. The activity drew journalists, police officers, engineers, physicists, and eventually parapsychologists. What made the case unusual wasn't just the events. It was the setting. This isn't folklore. This isn't hearsay. This was a functioning professional office during business hours. Clients present, employees working, visitors witnessing disturbances. And there was one detail investigators began to notice. The disturbances appeared to correlate with the presence of a 19-year-old secretary, Anne-Marie Schneider. When she entered the office, lights flickered. When she walked down the hallway, lamps were said to swing behind her. When she was absent, activity diminished. When she went on vacation, reports suggest the disturbances stopped altogether. When she returned, they resumed. Eventually, she was dismissed from the firm. After that, the activity ceased entirely. No further disturbances documented. No long-term haunting. No continuation. Just a strange cluster of months in 1967. And then, silence. But that silence didn't end the debate. It began it. Can you imagine working in this office building? Business as usual. Then all of a sudden, lamps hanging from the ceiling start to swing. Can you imagine being a visitor in an office building where this was the case? Sitting in the waiting room, and then we've got a secretary just out of high school, and behind her, the pictures on the wall start to spin by themselves. Now, it doesn't specify in the story what the mood or what the emotional state of the 19-year-old Anne-Marie Schneider was in when these things were happening. There are cases that have been captured regarding poltergeists that talk about women who are experiencing extreme moods. I don't want to completely generalize that all poltergeist situations are women. There is a higher percentage of the documented cases where teenage girls and late teenage women experiencing extreme moods have been present during poltergeist activity. It also doesn't specify in the story. It says that she was dismissed from the firm. It doesn't specify necessarily. It implies that she was fired. She was dismissed. Which also makes me think that maybe that last day could have very well been more intense, poltergeist activity-wise, than the entire time she was in the office. Of course, this is speculation, but it's really hard to say. An office building with rotary phones, a law office with a phone system that's able to make that many calls out on a rotary phone system is really hard for me to comprehend. Call centers now use auto dialers with digital phones that are all connected to the internet. But to think rotary phones is wild. We'll get into the debate next on the Midnight Drive. All right, we're back, and you are listening to the Midnight Drive. Tonight, we're talking about the Rosenheim Poltergeist. The first segment, we talked about the case, what was going on. In this segment, we're going to talk about the investigation, the psychokinesis, and skepticism that was wrapped around all of it. The debate that began after it all went down. The Rosenheim case might have faded into obscurity if not for one name: Hans Bender, a prominent German parapsychologist. Bender and a team that included physicists from the Max Planck Institute investigated the disturbance directly. Cameras were installed, audio recording equipment was set up, electrical measurements were even taken. Bender believed the events represented a form of psychokinesis. Unconscious, telekinetic activity triggered by emotional distress. He focused on Anne-Marie Schneider, not as a fraud, but as a perpetrator, but as what parapsychology calls a focal person. In many historical poltergeist cases, disturbances are said to cluster around adolescents or young adults experiencing stress. Schneider had reportedly gone through personal, emotional upheaval. According to Bender, her internal tension may have manifested externally, converted into physical disturbance, lights flickering, phones dialing, objects moving. He described the events as potentially intelligently controlled forces, but not necessarily spirits. More like unconscious human influence. Not everyone agreed. Skeptics later argued that Bender's investigation lacked rigor, that no full technical report was ever even published, that alternative explanations were not sufficiently ruled out. A book titled False Spirits, Real Swindlers alleged that nylon threads had been discovered attached to fixtures in the office. Threads that could cause movement if they were pulled. Others pointed out inconsistencies in filmed evidence. In one report, a painting was said to have rotated 360 degrees. Later, descriptions reduced that to 120 degrees. That is a significant difference. Dutch journalist Piet Hein Hobens criticized the investigation as incomplete. Physicist John Taylor suggested the electrical measurements may have been fraudulently produced or misinterpreted. And there was an allegation that the secretary had once been caught in deceptive behavior by a policeman. This was a detail that Bender reportedly did not emphasize at all. But here's the thing. No definitive fraud was ever legally proven. No conclusive mechanical explanation accounted for every claim. No unified scientific consensus emerged. Instead, the case fractured into interpretation. People who believe it all cite there's multiple witnesses. They documented electrical recordings. All of the professional involvement. This was a literal office building during literal office hours. The skeptics cite possible, even probable, trickery, group expectation. If you know that you're going to the haunted law office, what are we going to see? Measurement error. And it's good old-fashioned psychological reinforcement. The Rosenheim Poltergeist endures not because it proves anything, but because it sits uncomfortably in the middle. Let's recap. It happened in a modern office, in a technologically advanced society. It happened under observation, and yet it never resolved cleanly. If it was fraud, it was never fully exposed. If it was paranormal, it was never proven without a shadow of a doubt. And that ambiguity is powerful because it forces a deeper question. The question is not, do ghosts exist? The question is not, do poltergeists exist? But rather, how do humans interpret disruption? When technology fails in strange ways, what patterns appear where none should? When stress and environment intersect, what story do we build around it? The Rosenheim case isn't just about flickering or exploding lights. It's about modernity confronting mystery. A law office, a filing cabinet, a telephone line, and a young woman at the center of speculation. No castle, no graveyard, just fluorescent lights and so many unanswered questions. And perhaps that's why it still lingers. Not as proof, not as debunked, but as something in the space in between. What a wild thing to consider. 1967 is when that happened. What do you make of all this? Feel free to give us a call, leave us a message, give us a recap, tell us your thoughts. 402-610-2836. If you're watching on YouTube or you're listening on another platform, please feel free to leave us a comment. We'll see you next time, my friends, on the Midnight Drive.